Hello and welcome to this OAuth 2 session. I'm Paul Matthews. I'm a developer programs engineer on the AdWords API, and this is Mark.
Hi, my name is Mark Wanschneider, and I'm a developer advocate here at Google, and I also work on the AdWords API team.
So today we're going to talk to you about authorization, and in particular OAuth 2. At the moment, changes are coming for the authentication of your applications. At the moment, many of your apps are using client login, and this is the sort of flow for how client login is authenticating with the service. So your app talks to the authentication service, blah, blah, blah. Your app gets an access token, or an auth token in this case. Your app talks to the product API servers and passes a developer key and access token, and your app has to periodically re-authenticate with the service. So this, as I said, is called client login. So how will it work in the new world? So in the OAuth 2 world, your app will talk to the application servers, your app gets an access token, sound familiar? Your app talks to the product API servers and passes in the developer key and access token, and your app has to periodically re-authenticate. So this new way of doing it is OAuth 2. Don't panic, this shouldn't be a big deal for you, and it will drastically improve security of your applications and data. So what's wrong with client login? Why do we want to move away from it? What's the investment worth for you? At the moment, client login works on a process of username and passwords for products being shared around.
And you actually have to put them in your code, so your code base is sitting there with your username and password stuck in it, which is not ideal.
Exactly, and you know, if it's quite easy to accidentally get your code leaked out to the world, and if that happens, then you're sending private credentials out there, which is a very bad security practice. So once you authenticate with our servers or authentication servers, at the moment your access token, your auth token, lasts for around 2 weeks. There's no way to revoke this token, or no easy way to revoke this token at present. And the main thing, the real driver behind this, is that client login is being deprecated by, is being sunset by 2015, and it might be sooner. It's actually been deprecated mode since last year, so it's really time to start thinking about changing over to the new pastures new.
Definitely being discouraged.
Yep. So why OAuth 2? Well, OAuth 2 primarily, and this is the driver, is more secure. It doesn't expose usernames and passwords, and you only exchange OAuth tokens. You get more specific access control, so rather than allowing any person with your credentials access to all of your data, you can rein in and allow them access to particular portions of your data. Tokens,
or even APIs. I can say, like, with a particular set of OAuth tokens, this one can only access the mapping APIs, this one can only access certain geolocation APIs and everything. You can actually severely restrict the scope of the individual access credentials being issued. So again, if they're compromised, the amount of damage that can be done is limited.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, as he was alluding to, it drastically reduces the impact of the if a token is compromised. There's no capture challenges with OAuth 2, which is really good for any of you that might want to put this system into, let's say, an automatic process like a cron job or something like that, where capture would just halt the whole process and stop it dead. And we've learned a lot from the OAuth 1.0 days, and really, you know, the standard has grown up a lot, and OAuth 2 is a much better revision. So, what are the key steps to OAuth 2? Well, you start off by registering an OAuth application. This is very simple, and we'll go through that shortly. You authenticate to get an auth code, so that's with the authentication service. You exchange your auth code for an access token and a refresh token, more on that later, and you call the product API with the access token. So, and finally you handle token expiration. So you'll see a lot of this happens before you even get into calling the APIs that you're used to. So step 1, registering the application. You go to code.google.com/APIs console, and you create a new project. This is how you create a new project. So you just hit the create project button, it's nice and easy, and it will take you through to this screen, and it'll actually take you through to the overview screen, where you can click on API access and create a new OAuth 2 client ID and secret. Well, you'll be prompted with this box. There's no saying that we don't show you every in-depth detail of this. So this box will allow you to put in your product name, and that's really the crucial part of this. You can put in a product logo if you have one, and maybe a homepage URL for additional information. And the next step, you choose the application type, the workflow type, the OAuth 2 type. More on that later, but in this particular example, we're selecting the web application, the web flow layout, and we're filling out other additional details that might be needed to achieve that flow. And finally, there's a redirect URL at the bottom, and we get the create client ID. And it'll produce something like this. You'll see this nice little box. It'll explain it to you, where it'll give you the client ID, email address, client secret, redirect URLs, and JavaScript. All that information that you have to deal with for the OAuth 2 login. And conveniently, there's a download to JSON format, so you can just pick this all out as a file and drop this into most Google applications or Google libraries, and it should read from that. So next up.
So I'm going to go here into sort of the, I guess, slightly more technical details about how all this works and everything. I'm going to go back one slide here and sort of mention here that you can download, you'll see here on the right, you can download these credentials and everything. And, you can actually just copy them from this page. But typically what we'll do is we'll download the JSON, keep that in a JSON file. And again, that's not perfect, but you can't have the perfect security model. And again, having these credentials stored in your source tree is far safer than having your username and password, because if they get compromised, you can easily just revoke them, and with the delete button you see right here, and then ask for a new set of credentials. So this picture here is from our Google OAuth sort of documentation page, so you can go onto the internet and view it later. We will show you the link for that at the end of this presentation. But the basic flow is your application here is going to begin the authentication process, and it's going to ask Google to begin the authentication process and start giving me some tokens and everything. This is going to redirect my application to some sort of Google authentication page or pop-up or some sort of scheme, depending on what type of application I have, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Once Google has decided to authenticate me and has verified that the user and password are all kosher and everything, they will send back a code to my application or my web app or something. My application then, with that code in hand, recalls Google again, exchanges those for token response, which has a couple of different things in it, which we can use to call the APIs. All right, so before we scare everybody with all the technical details, if you're using Google client libraries, they're almost all already up to date in all the languages for all of this authentication and all of these different methods. So you should be able to just change your methods to OAuth 2.0 and have everything work. You just need to plug in the secret and the tokens that you got from the API console earlier on. For those few libraries that are possibly out of date right now or don't handle everything quite perfectly, you should expect those to be migrated over and fully supported in the very near future, as we're moving everything away from client login towards this OAuth 2.0. So if you're not using a client library and you're coding this stuff by hand, let's go into the details a little bit more of how you do that. You send a request to the Google Authorization server with what you want to access. This is what we said earlier was the scope. So for example, if I'm writing an app that uses the AdWords API, I'll say I want to authenticate this application against this URL, which is the AdWords. I also pass in the client ID and the client secret, which we got from the API console in that JSON file. Now we have to actually go and authenticate it. In most of the flows, this will involve actually Google popping up a login dialog or validating that the user wants to grant your application access to the APIs on their behalf and sort of tell Google they're doing things with it. Once you've given that, the Google servers return a code back to your application that your application can, in the final step, exchange for an access token and a refresh token. So, how do we use these tokens that are returned? The access token is the token that I pass into the API calls. It is passed in actually as a header and under an HTTP header called authorization, and you say OAuth and you pass in this token that you got back. This expires after about an hour. I've seen, maybe a few minutes, give or take, on this, but roughly after an hour, this token will stop working. And actually, when you first get these tokens back, you actually get a timeout value with that JSON response.
It's probably worth saying, and that's usually the one that you want to go on. You don't necessarily need to make the request to confirm that it's still valid. You just go via the timeout, and then after the timeout, you just refresh your token. You wouldn't bother waiting until it definitely expired.
Right. Okay. And then you do have this refresh token, and the refresh token is how you actually get another access token when your access tokens do time out. So the nice thing about these is I don't need to pop up the authentication dialog again. The user doesn't have to come back and enter their username or password or authorize my app or click any buttons. I just say, all right, that old token has expired. Please give me a new access token with this refresh token, and I'll get a new one. So you should probably store that when you first get it, so that when your access token does expire, you'll be given a new one. You'll be able to get a new access token from that refresh token. So let's talk a little bit about the various different flows. The nice thing about OAuth 2.0 and the big improvements it offers over OAuth 1.0 are the ways in which it supports the various different apps, whether they be web applications, mobile applications on your Android or other type of phone, or even server-side applications. There are some flows that we won't get time to talk about today, but they're for true server-side scenarios. You can even skip some of the parts of this process if you can sort of pre-verify the security and sort of isolated nature of your application. But the key ones here, we'll start with the web flow, which is I'm writing a web application. Somebody browses into my application. That application now needs to use a Google API, so it will redirect to Google for authentication. Once Google has verified I am who I say I am and is happy with me, they redirect back to my application with a little code that my application can then exchange for those two tokens and go ahead and start calling the API as it wishes. Another way that this can be done is what's called the installed app flow, and for sure the most common use of this will be in mobile applications on iOS or on Android. The user starts using my application. I want access to an API. I need to authenticate. I'll pop up a web view control with the Google authentication page on it. The user authenticates. And then when Google is happy with that authentication, there's this funny problem where we got to figure out how do we get that code back to the application. And amazingly enough, in the OAuth 2.0 world, the way this is done is you set the title of the web view, you set the title of the next page that the OAuth server is showing, and then the installed application here will actually scrape that web view controller, whatever it is, grab the title, and then exchange that for a access token and a refresh token. So that's how that does, and you can totally see this being done in your installed applications. Now it's worth noting that installed application flow popping up a web view is it does sort of have some security implications and some security concerns with it. Theoretically, anybody can pop up an HTML page that sort of looks like a Google login, screen or some sort of other login screen, and we might want to worry about that a little bit. So there are a couple of options for us to do it better on in particular here I'll talk about iOS and Android. On iOS, my application can actually register a custom URL handler to receive the code from Google. And then also the Google apps, whether I'm using Google Plus or something else on my iOS device, it will have a custom URL handler. And I can actually say, go ahead and call that to authenticate my application. Once Google has verified that my application is properly authenticated, it'll actually call that custom URL handler that I've registered, because I set that as the redirect URL in the API console, and that'll actually just switch right back to my application with that code that I need to exchange for the two tokens. So that's actually a way. It is a little funny in iOS. You'll see the app quickly switch to Google, and then if I've already authenticated, it'll just actually switch right back to my app. Otherwise, I'll enter my username and password, and then it'll switch back to my app. It works really well, and again, it's definitely more secure than a web page or something. The great part is that actually for Android users, there are built-in authorization managers to do all of this for you and handle OAuth. And indeed, if you're trying to authenticate against the sort of primary account on your Android device, it'll just seamlessly go through the whole authentication process for you. So that is definitely the most secure way to do that on those two mobile platforms. For web applications, also, a lot of people are starting to move away from this switch to a full Google page, authenticate, and then switch back to my application. And there's this new methodology being done using HTML5's window post message, where actually I create an iframe with sort of the Google authentication system in it. I post messages to it. It decides whether it needs to do a pop-up and get my username, password, and everything. And then my web application and the iframe communicate with each other, get the code back, exchange those for tokens and everything. So this is a new way that's being done. You're seeing this a lot right now with Google+, and I think you'll see this expand to a lot more services here at Google and everything. So it's definitely something you can explore, especially if you're really working with HTML5 and a lot of the new stuff. And back to Paul.
Okay, so OAuth 2 best practices. To start off, although we give you a refresh token and an access token, we really expect you to use the access token as much as possible. So yes, in theory, you could refresh your access token on every call to the API, but firstly, you're making pointless additional calls to our APIs, and that's going to be a performance hit to you. And secondly, it's going to increase our load and slow down the whole process our end as well, meaning a lower quality of service for yourselves. So we really expect you to honor the sort of the timeout value of any returned token. So secondly, you must make sure you store the refresh token for reuse. If you don't store the refresh token, what you end up with is always having to ask for user interaction. Now obviously that's just about acceptable on some applications, but if you're talking about any services or anything like that you don't want a user involved in, then that's going to be a serious problem. And secondly, a user is going to become rather agitated with your application if you're having to give consent on every request. And also, obviously, it reduces the number of round trips to the service. So, how to handle expired tokens? What do I need to handle expired tokens? Basically, your application. So.
Your application today, when you're using client login, has to already have logic to handle timeouts. Like you need to be able to handle the case where Google's servers come back and say your client auth token has already expired. So you already need to have logic today to say, oh, whoops, my token has expired. Pause this call, go ahead and re-authenticate, and then go back and resume that call. So you've probably already got logic for this, or you should have logic to handle this sort of token timeout thing. So theoretically, switching to OAuth with the timeout being every hour shouldn't be a big deal. If you haven't written that code yet, you're definitely going to need to now with the shorter timeouts. And
additionally, on top of that, if you're writing the code to handle the handshake, the client consent, you don't want to write that code and then strip it out. This consent step could, in theory, come back and hit you again. So the point is that you want to leave that in your code, even if it's an installed flow, a service application like a cron job or something. You still want to leave that in your code, and then just to be able to handle that experience. So, in summary, change is coming. It shouldn't be a big deal, and it shouldn't be too much coding or hard work on your end to handle it. It'll actually improve the application security and thus reduce liability and worry for system administrators everywhere. Any client library users of Google client libraries should be able to switch over now or pretty soon. So
change is coming. I immediately winter is coming.
So this would be time for a Q&A had we got any people on the Hangout, but unfortunately no one showed up today, so we're going to skip past this. So on to some links for you, and the main one here is the developers.google.com/account/docs/OAuth2. This will give you the vast majority of OAuth 2 information you'll need.
If you don't remember that, just Google search Google APIs OAuth. You'll go. It's the first organic result, absolutely.
And secondly, if you find yourself needing to register your account, you need to look at the code.google.com/apis/console. So that'll be where you register your account, as I showed you previously. Okay, so thank you for watching this OAuth 2 session. I've been Paul Matthews.
And you still are Paul Matthews. And I remain Mark Watschneider, and it's been a lot of fun, and we hope you learned something from it today.
Thank you ever so much.